have the pleasure of being with Steve Kaufman. Steve grew up in the English-speaking region of Montreal, Canada, and he's a graduate of l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris, also known as Sciences Po in Paris, in France. And he's a former Canadian diplomat, founder of Link.com, and he runs a company involved in the international wood products trade. His blog, The Linguist on Language, is dedicated to his language learning passion. Steve speaks about 14 languages. He's a regular contributor to the language learning community on the web. He has a lot of videos on YouTube, for example. And Steve has been a huge inspiration to me in the past couple of years. I've followed him for many years, and he's always very, very open about the strategies he uses for language learning. And today we're going to ask him about his opinion on whether learning languages is a hard thing and what we can do to make it a little bit easier. So, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
So, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be...
It's not raining here in Vancouver, so...
Yeah. Same here in Ottawa. We do have finally some nice weather, although it was a pretty cold winter. So I will be asking you a few questions, if you're fine with that.
Yep.
And that's going to be surrounding the topic of language learning difficulty and whether it's hard to learn a language and what we can do to make it easier. So first of all, a lot of people are afraid to learn a language, or they just will never do it because they've been told it's something that is just too difficult. So really, just how difficult is it to learn a foreign language in your opinion, and why?
Well, it's funny. I had a question on my YouTube channel from someone who said, why is learning a language so difficult? So that's what kind of got me thinking about the subject. I don't think it's necessarily difficult. If we go to countries like Sweden, most of the population speaks English, possibly another language. In Singapore, most of the population speaks 2 or 3 languages. I've never thought that people in Sweden or Singapore were born with a special language learning gene, but they have a different attitude. They just think it's something that quite naturally I'm going to do, I have to do, everyone does. And I think people who consider language learning difficult, and I shouldn't say it's not just that they consider it difficult, it's that they've actually had difficulty. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of people who study languages, particularly in North America, and maybe Quebec is a bit of a different situation there because I think there's greater motivation to learn English in Quebec than to learn other languages in other parts of North America. Mm-hmm. So most of them find it difficult. Why? I think there's a number of reasons. One, because their expectations maybe are out of whack. They think that they can just pick up a book, leaf through some declension tables, or try to study them, should be able to start speaking, and in short order, they should be able to speak quite well. That's just not how it works. You need massive exposure to the language. Mm-hmm. The Swedes, for example, they're watching English television from a very early age. They don't learn English because they don't do anything differently in schools from what we do. They do the same. They study grammar. That's not where they learn. They learn because they have this massive exposure. So I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of time you actually have to spend with the language. And so they go at it in a way that's quite difficult, with a lot of focus on things that are inherently difficult and uninteresting. Like trying to memorize declension tables or conjugation tables is very difficult. Mm-hmm. So, if you're prepared to put in the time, and I noticed on some of your blog posts, you emphasize the importance of enjoying the process. So if you're prepared to put in the time, and if you can find a way to enjoy the process, then I don't think language learning is difficult.
So it's all about enjoying yourself and getting to know yourself more as a learner, would you say?
It's about that. I think it's about not being too concerned about how much you can say at the beginning, how well you can say things, but rather accepting the fact that you're going to have to gradually get used to the language, and that your initial focus should be to understand the language and to acquire a lot of words. Here again, I was reading through your blog, this whole idea that with 5% of the words you can understand 90%. I've never found that to be the case. As I learned, right now I'm learning Ukrainian. I've learned so many different languages, even after you have a fairly large vocabulary, because a lot of the key words you don't have. You can't make sense of what's being said. You may know the words go, come, the, because, you, he, all of the most common words that account for 70%, 80%. But you actually need a large vocabulary in order to understand. And so you have to acquire that through this process of lots of listening and reading. And for those people who don't enjoy doing that, then language learning can be difficult. Unless they want to limit themselves to being able to say, hello, how are you, my name is. But if you actually want to achieve some degree of fluency, you have to put in time. But the secret is to find a way to put in the time that you find enjoyable. I find, for example, if I compare language learning to improving my golf game, I know that all the time I put into language learning is going to give me a return. The more time I put in, the better I'm going to get. That's not true of golf, because not everyone can hit a golf ball. Not everyone's going to be a figure skater. Not everyone is going to be a great, artist. So there are so many things that are genuinely difficult, where no matter how much time I put into drawing or singing, I'm never going to be good at drawing or singing. I know that, because it takes very, very specific, talent, aptitude. But in language learning, I think anyone who puts in the time, exposing themselves to the language, gradually starting to talk, they're going to improve. So to me, from that perspective, it's not necessarily difficult. I don't know if that makes sense.
So you believe that for activities like drawing or singing, you do need a particular aptitude, but not for language learning?
Yeah, let's put it this way. I think you need aptitude in both, but I think the factor aptitude is less important.
Less important.
Let's say everyone in Sweden can speak English.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't believe they have a special gene, but I don't think everybody in Sweden is good at drawing.
Indeed.
So to some extent, presumably, if you're not good at singing, you can improve. But the difference is, like, we all more or less speak our own language. If we look at sports, obviously some people are more gifted than others.
Yeah.
And we see kids that play hockey or whatever, and they all put in the same amount of time. And some kids become stars, superstars, and other kids don't. Whereas I think in language, a far greater number of people can achieve a high level of proficiency if they put in the time and if they learn in a effective way.
And speaking of language difficulty, so that's my second question here. From your own experience, has language learning become considerably easier as you got to know yourself better as a language learner and as you gained experience learning languages?
Oh, no question. I'm a far better language learner today than I was back when I was a 16-year-old. I have more confidence, and that's important. Another reason why people find language learning difficult is because they don't think they're going to achieve fluency. They've never done it before. Mm-hmm. So once I achieved genuine fluency in French, then I felt confident that I could do it in other languages. So I have the confidence. I've done it. So now I have an approach to language learning that I know works, at least works for me. So I don't waste my time. And then the other big thing is just the explosion of convenient technology. The MP3 player, the availability of resources on the internet. For every language that I've wanted to learn over the last 10 years, the amount of stuff on the internet is phenomenal. And I can carry it around with me in my little iPod Nano.
Yeah.
And listen to it. So, and Link, of course, and the technology that we have there, I used to have to deliberately find textbooks, readers that had glossaries in them, because I wasn't going to go looking words up in a dictionary. It's simply too time consuming. And as soon as you close a dictionary, you've forgotten what you looked up anyway.
Yeah.
So I would scour secondhand bookstores for these readers with glossaries. Well, now you don't need to do that, because you can use online dictionaries. You can access anything. So there's no question that it is far easier, that I personally, first of all, as a person, I'm a better language learner, but that the whole environment for language learning has made it much, much easier than it was 40, 50 years ago.
So, to sum it all up, if people use the right tools, and if they gain experience and they get to know themselves better as a language learner, language learning itself is going to become easier. There's no doubt about this.
It becomes easier, and even within your first language, if you haven't done it before, as you get going, you gain more confidence. Again, as long as so this whole issue of difficulty relates to expectations. If your expectation is that within a very short time you can speak fluently, you're going to be disappointed. But if your expectation is that you can enjoy the language more and more as you understand more and more of it, that you get a sense of power and achievement as you acquire more words, as things that were unintelligible to you before now become clearer and clearer, even though they remain a little foggy, and that's language learning, but they become clearer and clearer to you. Then with that confidence, obviously you know how the brain works. If you get a sense of achievement, you want to do more of that because you feel you're mastering something that's just a little difficult for you, but you're getting there. So, and I think as people gain that sense of confidence, then they will, even the first language becomes easier, and subsequently additional languages become easier. I'm sure you've had that experience.
Yeah, totally. But I would also add that at the other end of the spectrum, if you start off learning a language with the idea that you're never going to be able to do it, it's just too hard, it's impossible, that's not going to work either, isn't it?
No way. No way.
So you have to have realistic expectations about, learning a language, how hard it is or how easy it is, and you have to believe in yourself, be confident that you can do it, and yet not have unrealistic expectations that you can either become fluent in a matter of weeks or that you're never going to be able to do it.
Yeah, the thing is, it's not difficult, but it takes time. And when I talk about realistic expectations, I mean about the amount of time it takes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you have to be realistic. But it's not difficult. It's just a matter of putting in the time.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of difficulty, now that we're on the subject and you speak of time, have you found that some languages are considerably harder than others? For example, you've been learning Korean as of recently. How are you finding Korean compared to, say, Spanish or German?
Well, there are a number of factors that will influence the difficulty of a language. The first one, because I'm very much vocabulary oriented, if you have a language, say Spanish and English, that share 50% the same vocabulary, mm-hmm. Obviously it's easier for an English speaker to learn Spanish than to learn Korean. Because in Korean, you have to learn every word from scratch. So you have nothing to identify it with, nothing, which is, it's much more difficult to remember words that have, there's nothing you can relate it to.
Yeah.
So obviously languages that are of this, even if they're not of the same language group, like Chinese and Japanese, but they share 50% of the same vocabulary. So you have an advantage. So that's one thing. The other thing that makes a language difficult is the complexity of the grammar. Mm-hmm. In that sense, Slavic languages I find difficult because in Korean there are a lot of endings, different endings to words, but there are logical reasons for those endings. So therefore, it's easier to remember. Whereas the declension tables in Russian, there's no rhyme or reason as to why it should be I, U, A. There's no particular reason. The genitive feminine doesn't suggest I, whereas the genitive masculine suggests A. There's no rational reason. So you have to remember those things. And that just takes a lot of practice and exposure. Chinese is difficult, obviously, because you have to learn the writing system and you have to learn the tone. So every language has its difficulties, but by and large, the closer the language is to your own language group or to a language you already know, obviously the easier it's going to be.
Very good.
Easier means you'll learn it faster. But if you're enjoying the process, so it takes longer, you enjoy it, so it doesn't matter.
Of course. It is a challenge. I mean, I see it as a challenge. The harder the language you learn, the bigger the challenge and the more interesting it can get as well. So.
Right. It's a bit like if you go for a walk, a hike in the woods, and your only concern is to reach the finish line, you're not going to enjoy the forest.
Indeed.
So you go on a shorter walk, a longer walk. Spanish is a shorter walk. Chinese is a longer walk. But if you enjoy the process, it doesn't matter. But you should be realistic as to the amount of time it takes.
Okay, on to my third question. You talked about technology and how language learning has become easier through things such as MP3s and iPods and whatever, iPads or whatever. What's your opinion on an experience of classroom-based language teaching? And do you think the way languages are taught in school should be reformed? Do you think, for example, they could make better use of technology?
Well, let me quote a few sort of facts. I read once on the internet that in New Brunswick, which is the only bilingual province in Canada, as you know, in the English language school system, they teach French from grade 1, and they teach 30 minutes a day of French. And they found that after 12 years, the average level of oral proficiency of the graduates of the New Brunswick English language school system, the number of students who achieved what they called intermediate oral proficiency was 0.66%.
Wow.
Wow. I imagine that there are more people than that who have a Francophone parent. In other words, the school system was essentially irrelevant in terms of the goal. And I think if you look at the English language school system, most kids, if they're not in French immersion, after 6, 8, depending on the province, however many years, they graduate and they're not capable of speaking French. And I gather that the same is true in the US insofar as Spanish instruction. So that's at one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, I attended a meeting of the American, whatever it's called, ACT, Association of Teachers of Foreign Language, and I met some excellent people down there. I met one lady, Chinese lady, in her late 50s, who was using the iPhone in her classroom to help teach Chinese characters. So I am sure that there are many innovative teachers in the system who are using technology. My reaction overall has been that the educational establishment, language teachers in our schools, or for that matter, the whole ESL program for immigrants, that the major motivation of the practitioners, the teachers there, is to protect the existing system.
Of course.
And to protect the dominant position of the classroom. To protect the idea that it's the teacher who sets the curriculum. The teacher decides what people are going to do. And they're largely reluctant. And even those teachers who want to wander away from that are prevented from doing so by the system, by the bureaucracy, by the language school director. So, and maybe by the parents who want the conventional, they want to see their kids tested on something. So, in the case of French instruction in English Canadian schools, kids are tested. And some kids do well, because in school, some kids do well in math and some kids do poorly. And they'll be tested, as I'm sure in New Brunswick. I'm sure the brighter kids did well on the French test, year after year after year. And at the end of 12 years, they couldn't speak French. So I think there's some fundamentally things that we have backwards in language instruction. One of the things that I think is wrong is trying to get people to produce the language too early and then correcting them all the time. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's far better to focus on understanding and finding ways to allow the kids to enjoy the language. And if they get it wrong, they get it wrong. What does it matter that so-and-so student in New Brunswick either did well or didn't do well in these tests on, the subjunctive or conjugating verbs, if at the end of the 12 years he can't speak anyway? Right. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So, yeah, I think there's some real issues. But I think more and more, even in a classroom, if the learner isn't motivated, he or she's not going to learn. So no, I think what's wrong is that they focus on getting people to use the language too early. I think you need a lot of understanding. You need to focus on comprehension, understanding, which can be done for kids. They can watch cartoons, movies, find books for them to read, things to listen to, and don't force them to try and speak until they want to. But of course, parents don't want that. They want to see the little kid say something in French. Then they're, because the little, whatever can say something in French. So I hope that changes.
Okay, very good.
I'm hopeful. I'm not
interesting
hopeful.
Insights.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve. Well, before we finish off this interview, do you have any additional tips to language learners, or maybe some suggestions that you would like to make to people?
Well, I think language learning is very much a personal journey, and so the number one issue is motivation. So if people really want to learn a language, then they have to take charge. They have to find the method of learning that they like the best, because if they like that method of learning, they will put in enough time. And ultimately, in order to succeed in language learning, you have to put in the time. You're only gonna put in the time if you're motivated, if you find different ways of learning that you like. You know, to me, it's listening and reading. I don't do much flashcarding. I don't, I'm not that concerned about speaking until I have a certain foundation in the language. This is a method that's worked for me, but it might very well be that other people have no interest in reading, no interest in listening. So they have to find their own path. But it's important to find the path that works for you so that you enjoy it, so that you put in the time. Because if you enjoy it and you put in the time, you will succeed. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Steve.
Okay.
These were very interesting insights, and I hope people are going to have enjoyed this interview. Thanks for your time. It was fantastic speaking to you.
Okay, not at all. Thank you.